Hi, students, and welcome back. So I am Professor Fernetovich, showing you fundamentals of chemistry and chemistry for botanists. So what I have here is my hydrogen bonding between water molecules. This is where we left off. Down below, if it's cut off, it says hydrogen bonding between water molecules. So that's what we were talking about. There are four major types of bonds that we have in biology that we see. The covalent bonds, which are polar and nonpolar, hydrogen bonds, and then ionic bonds, which are less common. So we were talking about hydrogen bonds when we left off. Water, very important. We are going to talk about how this polarity of water, the polarity caused by the unequal sharing of electrons between the oxygens and hydrogens, contributes to adhesion and transport of water in plants later on. So don't forget this. Now, we're going to look at some bigger picture stuff now, talking about the elements that we see in plants and then some of the polymers that we see in plants as well that are made up of molecules. So a fertilizer bag is shown here, and I wanted to bring this up because when we grow plants, sometimes we need to add fertilizer and add nutrients, and the three major types of nutrients that we add are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, N, P, and K. And fertilizer bags usually have numbers in that order, representing the percent of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the fertilizer bag. So these elements are essential for plant growth. Nitrogen is needed for the growing stage of a plant. Phosphorus and potassium are more important with flowering and fruiting stages, but all are important for the plant. So yes, nitrogen, really important for vegetative growth. Phosphorus, potassium, flower seeds. Now within a plant, when we look at what elements we find in a plant, the most common elements we find are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, potassium. So those are some of the big ones. We put them together in different compounds, different compound molecules, and these larger compound molecules are called polymers. We see carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and nucleic acids as classes of polymers that are common in living things. So carbohydrates, we'll talk about those first. They're for short-term energy storage. These have the CHO configuration, and it's really for every carbon, there's twice as many hydrogens. And the oxygen ratio is the same as the carbon. So sometimes you'll see this as CH2O and multipliers of that. So these are our sugars, our starches, short-term energy storage. So when a plant does photosynthesis, it takes solar energy, it takes water up from the roots, carbon dioxide from the air, combines these things into carbohydrates. And some of those carbohydrates become starches, which are for longer short-term energy storage, and some are for sugars, which are sometimes short-term energy storage. Proteins we also see in plants, even though when we think of plants, we don't often think of like high protein foods. Every cell has proteins to it, and proteins are found as enzymes, and they're involved in cell communication. Proteins are made up of amino acids and have different ratios of elements, but we always see carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen in these proteins, and sometimes we see phosphorus and sulfur as well. Fats are for long-term energy storage. Plants will have oils or waxes to them that are made from fats. These are also carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. And the thing with fats is that they are formed with non-polar covalent bonds. So as opposed to water, which is polar, these non-polar substances don't mix with water. They don't have polarity. There's no positive, negative end to them. They're just solid. They like to be themselves. They don't like to mix with water and polar things. Lastly, we have nucleic acids found in plants. These are often found in and near the nucleus of a plant cell, and these are the genetic material and related RNA. So sometimes we call these polymers or macromolecules. Please ignore that chapter 5 at the top. This is in chapter 2. These molecules that I'm talking about, carbs, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, are large in size and made of many repeating units. So that's why we call it a polymer. A polymer means many parts, and the repeating units are called monomers or single parts. So starting out this table, we have lipids, some example fats, subunits. Lipids are made of glycerols and fatty acids. Carbohydrates are polysaccharides. That's one example. There are also monosaccharides and disaccharides. We'll look at that later. And their subunit is always a monosaccharide. That means single sugar. Proteins can be polypeptides. They're made up of repeating amino acids. And our nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, are examples, made up of repeating nucleotides. Now, we will focus on nucleic acids later on in the semester when we look at DNA and genetics for plants. These polymers are made through the process of dehydration. Sometimes that's called dehydration synthesis. It's the process of removing water to connect monomers together to make a polymer. And this is called polymerization. It could be a polymerization of glucose molecules to make starch, polymerization of amino acids to make a protein. You could talk of polymerization of glycerol and fatty acids to make a lipid. So dehydration does that, polymerizes our monomers into a polymer. Hydrolysis is the opposite. That's when we take the big thing and split it apart. Lysis means splitting, and hydro means splitting with the addition of water. So we could add water to separate polymers. You could think of it as dissolving, even though that's not quite what's going on. Here's a picture of dehydration reaction. So what we have here is a short polymer with 1, 2, 3 monomers. Okay. And here is one monomer over here. Now, monomers often have little functional groups attached to them. That's what this HO is. That's an oxygen and hydrogen. It's a hydroxyl functional group. You might see that in the text. And over here is a hydrogen. This is pretty typical, having those sticking off of the polymers. Over here is a monomer sticking off of the monomers. And over here is a hydroxyl group here, and a hydrogen over here. And when we get these two together, we got this short polymer. We could even imagine that this was one monomer here as well. Get these two together, the H and the OH combine to form H2O. That will leave the system. And because we've taken out the stuff in between, we could have 3 bonding to this 4th one over here to make a longer polymer. Okay, so dehydration, remove the water, and we get things to stick together, make something bigger. Hydrolysis is the opposite. Here we've got that same polymer configuration. We could add water, gets in between the two, and it splits it apart. So this is how a lot of molecules are made and broken apart in biology. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about those classes of macromolecules, those polymers, starting with carbohydrates. 3 types of carbohydrates that we often see in biology are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. For the monosaccharides, those are single sugar molecules, very simple. Their examples are glucose, which is blood sugar, ribose and deoxyribose, which we have in our DNA actually. We also have fructose, which is a fruit sugar, in lactose and galactose, which we find in milk products. So these are the smallest type of carbohydrates. They're sweet to the taste, and they could bond together. You could take two of them, bond them together to make a disaccharide. Di means two. And these bond together through that dehydration reaction. There would be an OH and an H sticking between. Water would leave, and we could bond them together. And we could get things like sucrose, which is when we have a glucose bonded to a fructose together. We could also bond glucose and glucose together to make maltose, malt sugar. So that's a little bit bigger. It's also very sweet to the taste. But then if we start to add more monosaccharides onto that, we end up with a very large molecule that's not sweet to the taste, more of a storage molecule because we've got all those bonds tying these monosaccharides together. These are our starches. We also have cellulose and chitin in this category. Poly means many, many saccharides together. This is what a common monosaccharide looks like. These three pictures, they show rings of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. Okay, glucose, galactose, and here's fructose. This one looks a little different because it has 5 carbons. 2, 3, 4, 5 here with an additional one sticking off. We call it a 5-carbon sugar or a pentose sugar. These are hexose sugars. So we have different types of monosaccharides. And here, this might look very busy to you, but this is some common disaccharides where we have those rings bonded together. Rings bonded together. Here and here. Sucrose, common table sugar, glucose and fructose. Here's lactose, milk sugar, which is galactose and glucose. Maltose. And then our starches occur when we have long chains of single sugars. This is showing long chains of glucose making starch, making amylose, which is actually a starch found in potato cells. It's not sweet, and I like to think of it as all the sweetness is wrapped up in the bonds in between the sugar molecules, so we don't taste it. We could break those apart through hydrolysis and then taste the simple sugars. And here is another polysaccharide. This is cellulose, where we have these long strands, just like in starch, but then cross bonds that link them together to form fibers. Cellulose fiber makes up the cell walls of plants. So this is where I want to end part 3 of Chemistry for Botanists. And there's one more part where we're going to finish up this talk.